So we've been talking about log forwarding for Windows, we've talked about it for Linux, and we talked about a centralized SIAM solution. But now what we're going to do is take a look at how you would actually configure syslog forwarding in Linux between two Linux hosts in our particular example. So let's get started first on the centralized host that will start receiving log entries sent from other Linux hosts. So in order for us to configure the centralized logging host to receive log entries from other Linux hosts, we have to turn on the fact that we're listening to receive those. And the way we do that is by using sudo to open up, so I'm going to use the nano text editor to open up the file in /etc, and it's called rsyslog.conf. Now in this text file, it's a configuration file for syslog, what I need to do is uncomment these lines here that refer to UDP connectivity. So the module load IM UDP line, I'm going to uncomment by removing the hashtag symbol. Same thing goes for the input line following it. So we're going to be enabling a listener on UDP port 514. You can change the port number, but that is normally what syslog uses. So that's really all I need to do here on the centralized syslog server. Depending on your environment, you might have to adjust firewall rules to allow that traffic to come in if it doesn't already allow it. So in this case, I'm good. I'm going to press Control X here in the nano text editor. It asks me to save the modified buffer. Well, of course, letter Y for yes. The file name to write to, it's already in there. I'm going to press Enter to accept it, and it's done. So what I need to do now is I need to restart the syslog service. The syslog service reads its config from the file we just edited. So I need to restart the service itself. I can do that with sudo service. As you might guess, it's called rsyslog, similar to the file, rsyslog, and then restart. Now, let's check the status of the command, because sometimes in Linux, you might start a service like this and it doesn't give you any output, but it generates an error. Now you will see that error sometimes only by viewing the status of the service. So why don't we do that? Up arrow key to bring up the previous command, because I don't want to have to type everything in. I'm going to change restart to status. From here, I see that the syslog service, yep, it's up and running, it's active. There's no error messages. They're usually in red, but I'm still reading it all. There's no errors. We're good. Now we can verify that the listener is enabled in a couple of different ways, including commands that we already learned about. Remember netstat? I'm going to run sudo netstat, and I'm going to pass it some parameters. Basically, I'm going to tell it I want to view numeric list protocol of UDP, and I'm going to pipe that to grep. Remember, grep is a line filter, just like the find command is in Windows. I only want to see lines that are related to rsyslog. And sure enough, I only see a couple of lines, which is telling me that on my local IP address, I am listening on port 514. Now, sometimes your local IP address or all addresses for all interfaces will be expressed as 0.0.0.0 for IPv4. Now that's fine. I'm listening on port 514. We're good. We're good to go. Now, the last thing we should do before we go to configure, I'm going to call it a log client device that will report here. Before we go there, let's take note of the IP address of this host, because we need to know that to point other client log devices to this one. If I run ifconfig, the IP address for this host is 10.1.1.5. Okay, I can remember that. So let's switch over to what I'm calling our Linux log client, which will forward events to this centralized host. So I'm on a different Linux host now that's going to be the log client. So what do I do here? Well, do you remember how we had to edit that text file on the centralized logging host? We need to do the same thing here, but we need to make a different entry. So sudo nano /etc/rsyslog.conf. That hasn't changed. Now what I want to do here is go to the very bottom to add a new line. Basically, I'm going to add a directive here that says, hey you, send some or all of your log entries to a host listening at this IP address. How do I do that? Well, at the very bottom, I'm going to add ***. What does that mean? Well, before I talk about what that means, let me give you another example. What I could do is say kern warn. What does that mean? It means I only want to send warning messages related to the kernel, the operating system kernel, to my centralized logging host. So by putting asterisk or star, what I'm saying is any log entry on this host sends it off to who I am going to direct you to. So I have star. Next thing I do after that is I put in an @ symbol and the IP address of our central logging host I want to send log entries to. That was 10.1.1.5. That's it. All I'm doing is directing it that I want these log entries, in this case all log entries, sent to that host. So Control X to save this change. I'll press the letter Y for yes, press Enter to accept the file name, and that's done. Now we have to restart the service, our syslog service, because it doesn't know about that change in the config file yet. No problem. sudo service rsyslog restart, just like we did on the other host. And like on the other host, what I would recommend doing with this kind of thing is checking the status, just in case, we had a typo or something like that. Well, when I view the status, I just see that the syslog daemon is running here. There are no error messages. It looks like we're ready to rock and roll. So here's what we're going to do to test it. Remember the logger command we learned about, where you can add your own custom log entry? Why don't we do that here on what we're calling our Linux log client? So that in turn is going to write a custom log entry here, but then we're going to go back to the centralized logging host and see if it's there. It better be. So let's find out. Logger, and in quotes, Dan testing log forwarding. Okay, that's my message. Enter. Now, let's see if that shows up first on this host where I type that in. So tail/var/log/syslog. See how all these commands that we learned about are coming together? Because realistically, you need to know them to be able to do anything meaningful in Linux. Anyway, if we take a look, sure enough, we have the log entry here for Dan testing log forwarding. But that's on the local host. Old news, we've already seen that. Let's go back to our centralized log forwarding host that should have received it and do the exact same thing. Okay, so back on the central logging host, I'm going to clear and I'm going to do a tail of /var/log/syslog. And sure enough, I have my message. It actually even shows me the name of the computer it came from, which is VM5. We're sitting at VM4. And of course, I see the actual message, Dan testing for log forwarding. So there it is, it's done. So we said that this is important because you need to have another centralized location, basically another copy, an active copy of important log messages, so that if we have corruption or if we have a compromised host where an attacker clears the logs, we still have them elsewhere because we configured log forwarding.